Hi, I'm Avery Trufelman, host of Hark Daily, a new way to hear the best moments from the world of podcasts. Each weekday morning, you'll hear 5 captivating clips from the day's news, culture, and more, all in 20 minutes. Check it out at harkdaily.com.
There is such an overwhelming amount of noise around Donald Trump's proposed nominees, their histories, their scandals, their beliefs, that it's easy to lose sight of one important pattern, which is Trump placing people in charge of critical cabinet positions who are utterly loyal to him. So ultimately, the real control of those agencies lies with the White House. I'm Hannah Rosen. This is Radio Atlantic. Today, we're going to talk about a key pillar of that strategy to centralize control, Trump's plans for the military. Okay, ready?
Ready.
Our guest is staff writer Tom Nichols, who's a professor emeritus at the Naval War College. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Hannah.
So there is so much to talk about in terms of Trump's proposed appointments. But today we're going to talk about military and security-related appointments because they are such high-stakes positions. From Trump's choice during this transition period, what are you picking up about his attitude towards the military establishment?
I think his appointments, particularly for Secretary of Defense, and some of the rumors that have been floated out of Mar-a-Lago about prosecuting military officers and wholesale firings, these are really direct shots at the senior officer corps of the United States. And I think of it as a direct attack on our traditions of civil-military affairs. He is trying to send a message that from now on, America's military officers are supposed to be loyal to him, first and foremost, and not the Constitution, because he still carries a pretty serious grudge against a lot of top military and civilian people during his first term as president who got in his way, or he thinks got in his way about doing things like, shooting protesters and using the military in the streets of the United States. So he's sending a pretty clear message that this time around, he's not going to brook any of that kind of interference.
So you think the source of his resistance or hostility towards the military are specific actions that they prevented him from taking, or is it things that, say, generals have said about him, negative things that they've said about him?
Oh, I don't think we have to pick between those. He believes in a world where he has total control over everything because that's how he's lived his life. So, of course, he's angry about all of that stuff. Reportedly, going back to things like Bob Woodward's accounts, where he calls the defense secretary and says, I want to kill Bashar Assad, the leader of Syria. And James Mattis says, yeah, okay, we'll get right on that. And then hangs up the phone and says, we're not doing that.
Right. So he doesn't want anyone to say we're not doing that anymore.
No matter what it is, and no matter how unconstitutional or illegal the order, he doesn't want anybody to say we're not doing that. And remember, the first time he ran, he said things like, if I tell my generals, which is a phrase he loves, if I tell my generals to torture people, they'll do it. And of course, immediately a lot of very senior officers said, no, sir, we will not do that. That's an illegal order, and, we can't do that. He doesn't want to hear any of that guff this time around.
So one thing is he doesn't want any future resistance from military leaders who might, counter things he wants done. Another is he seems to be purging from the past. Like NBC reported this weekend that they were drawing up a list of military officers who were involved in the withdrawal from Afghanistan, seeing whether they could be court-martialed. How do those two things fit together? Why is that part of the picture?
Well, the most important thing about that report from NBC is it's not about Afghanistan. If it really were about that and people were looking at it closely, you have to remember that a big part of why that was such a mess, and, Biden bears a lot of responsibility for that bungled pullout, but Trump's the guy who negotiated the agreement and demanded that everybody stick to it. So this is not about Afghanistan. This is about two things. It's telling former officers who crossed him that I am going to get even with you. I think a lot of this is just him trying to cut a path to get to people like Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And it's also a warning for the future that says, no matter what you do, no matter where you go, even if you retire, I can reach out and touch you. So if you're a colonel or a captain or a general or an admiral and you think about crossing me, just remember, I will get you for it. And that's what I mean about an attack on civil-military relations. Because the other problem and the reason this whole Afghanistan thing is such nonsense is these were officers who were following the legal and lawful orders of their commander-in-chief. If this report is confirmed, it's a huge muscle flex to say there is no senior military officer who is beyond my retribution if he doesn't or she doesn't do what I want done, no matter how illegal, no matter how unconstitutional, no matter how immoral. All I want to hear out of you is yes, sir, and that's it.
Can he do this? In other words, can you reach deep down enough in the military hierarchy to actually accomplish what he's trying to accomplish?
Sure. It doesn't take many people. I mean, there's a bunch of kind of legalistic stuff that's going to be difficult. The military, and I've actually counseled other people not to get wrapped up in the legality stuff because that's not what this is about. This isn't it. This is an effort at political intimidation. But you'd have to find people who are going to hold an Article 32 hearing it's kind of like the military has its own version of like a grand jury, right? And you'd have to find people willing to do that. But you could reach down and find some ambitious and, not very principled lieutenant colonel somewhere who says, sure, I'll be that prosecutor. I'll do that. Mm-hmm. You don't need thousands and thousands of people. You just need a handful of men and women who are willing to do this kind of stuff. And yeah, sure, he can get it done. Remember, this is the president who decided that the military didn't have the authority to punish its own war criminals and intervened and said, started handing out dispensations.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about someone who encouraged him not to punish those war criminals, right. And that is Pete Hegseth, right. Who he nominated for Secretary of Defense. Tom, in the circles of military people how did people react to that nomination?
Well, I've been careful not to ask anybody I know who's still serving because I don't want to put them on the spot. But a lot of the people that I worked with and a lot of my colleagues from my days working with the military, I think the first reaction was something along the lines of, if this is a joke, it's not funny. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are we being pranked? Are we being punked? I mean, the idea of Pete Hegseth running the Defense Department was so spectacularly bizarre. It's right up there with, Matt Gaetz running Justice. And so now, as it's sinking in, I think there's a real horror here. And not just about what could happen in foreign policy. I mean, my biggest clench in my stomach is thinking about a nuclear crisis where the president really needs the Secretary of Defense, needs this, sober and mature and decent man to give him advice. And he turns and what he gets is Pete Hegseth. Mm-hmm.
So let's say who Pete Hegseth is. Now that you've painted the picture,
let me just add that for a lot of my military friends and former military friends, there's a whole other problem, which is unlike other departments, the Secretary of Defense holds the lives of millions of Americans in his hands.
Wait, what do you mean? You mean because why? What do you mean by that?
Because those folks who serve in our military are completely dependent on the DOD for their housing, their medical care, right. Where they're going to live, what places they get assigned to, all of that stuff. I mean, the SecDef doesn't make those decisions individually every day, but if he turns out to be a terrible manager, the quality of life and perhaps the actual lives of people in the military can be really put under a lot of stress and danger by somebody who just doesn't know what he's doing. It's not like Ben Carson's a good example, right? Ben Carson was sent to HUD. He had no idea what he was doing. The department pretty much ran itself. And it's not like, the daily life of hundreds of thousands of people were going to be affected because Ben Carson didn't know what the hell he was doing. That's different than people who live under a chain of command to which they are sworn to obey that goes all the way to the E-ring of the Pentagon to the chair Pete Hegseth would be sitting in. That's a very different situation and very dangerous.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, at HUD, you go home at 5 o'clock, but
Exactly.
It's not like that. It's not like that in the Department of Defense. So it's totally obvious to you and the people why he's unqualified. Can we just quickly make that case? So he was a weekend host, Fox and Friends. He did end up serving overseas, and I think he has a Bronze Star.
He was a major. Yeah, he actually was a major. I think he has 2 Bronze Stars. Look,
So how does that compare to other people who've held this position, just so we make the case?
Other people who have held these positions have been either had long experience in the national security and national defense realm as senior executives who've come all the way up. I think Don Rumsfeld was one of the worst secretaries of defense ever, but he had served in related capacities and had administered a gigantic company that he was the head of. Now, that doesn't mean he had good judgment, but the Defense Department ran every day and things got done every day. Ash Carter was a well-known for, 30 years, a well-known defense intellectual who had contributed substantively to everything about defense, from conventional forces to nuclear weapons. I think one thing people need to understand is how much of dealing with the Defense Department is just dealing with the intricacies of money. Hegseth's going to sit at the top of all that with no experience in any of this, not in budgeting, not in strategy, not in dealing with allies. I mean, I keep having these just head-spinning moments where I think about the first day in the office and Pete Hegseth has to make calls to his equivalents, to his opposite numbers, as they do in this job. That's another thing that you don't do if you're the Secretary of HUD. You don't call all the housing secretaries on the planet to say hello. Hegseth's going to be on the phone with the Russian Minister of Defense. He's going to be on the phone with the Chinese Minister of Defense. The people that have had these jobs have had exposure to folks like that. This is a guy who's done none of that. Nothing.
Yeah.
There's literally zero background.
Yeah. I mean, what he lacks in qualifications and experience and everything else, he seems to make up for in this very forceful ideology that he has. I spent the weekend reading his latest book, War on Warriors. Can we just talk about it for a minute? I mean, here's what I understand about it. He tells this kind of alternate history of the downfall of the American military.
Right.
It basically adds up to DEI. It goes, while we were fighting in Afghanistan, we missed the real war, which was happening at home, which was, women in combat roles and DEI all over the place. So basically a war against what he calls normal dudes who have always fought and won our wars. Now, I'm going to torture you by reading one passage, and then I would love to get your opinion about how widespread this ideology is. This idea that the culture war has utterly shaped the military. Is he an outlier, or do a lot of people think this? So here's the quote. DEI amplifies differences, creates grievances, excludes anyone who won't bow down to the cultural Marxist revolution ripping through the Pentagon. Forget DEI. The acronym should be DIE or IED. It will kill our military worse than any IED ever could. Where do these ideas come from? Is this just sprouted from his own head, or is there inside the military, as far as you know, like a grand resistance against DEI initiatives?
This comes from morning editorial meetings at Fox. Because, I worked with senior military officers, including, a lot of my students who had just come back from deployments. And you just didn't hear anybody talk this way about, Marxism rampant in the Pentagon and, DEI is destroying us. In part because a lot of those folks were standing right next to people that Hegseth would say were DEI promotions. Mm-hmm. This is kind of the out-of-control bro culture that Hegseth came up in. And some of it's just generational, I suppose, within the military. But, what I've found is actually that the military, for all of its flaws, is a pretty meritocratic institution. Have there been cycles of this where there's a lot of sensitivity training and DEI issues? Yeah, of course, because we're a more diverse country. I'm sorry, but welcome to the world of the 21st century. And what Hegseth and other guys are doing in that book, which is just kind of a big primal bro culture yawp, is saying, I just don't like this. So I just think, the idea that somehow Hegseth, he wasn't chosen because of this. He was chosen because he's a fawning sycophant to Donald Trump. He looks good on TV, which is really important to Trump. And he basically has made it clear he'll do anything Trump tells him to do, which is, I think you see this on all of Trump's appointments.
Yeah. Okay, so to summarize, he hates DEI. He pushed Trump to intervene in the case of those service members who were accused of war crimes. What is this reimagined military? How do you think Trump sees a reimagined military? What is the American military for? What is it doing under his vision?
Right.
I mean, if it's just window dressing, he wants a nice parade and he wants a lot of military officers parading with him and he wants it to look a certain way, that's one thing. But if if the intention is to use it for mass deportations or for, turning against internal protesters, then that's different. Well, then we're living in a different country.
And he just said that, right? He said, I'm going to do mass deportations and I'm going to get the military involved. And one thing I can tell you that I know from, more than 25 years of teaching military officers, they hate the idea of any internal role. The ethos of the American military officer is that they are there to defend the United States and not to be in the streets of the United States. Mm-hmm. And this is an old tradition that goes back a long way. And Trump just doesn't care about that. He thinks it's like his private security force to be ordered around at his beck and call.
I will say about Heth, most of the things in his book did not surprise me. The one thing that did surprise me is it does seem to be a sustained argument for why the left is the actual enemy, like a foreign enemy.
Right.
You know, he talks about how they move, how they fight, how to root them out. I mean, the language is very resonant with Trump's idea of the enemy from within.
Right. I mean, part of the problem I had with it, is that sometimes you just kind of stop and say, this is childish. This is almost like right? That it comes across as like this really sort of adolescent fantasy of, the internal enemy and how, Christian warriors like me are going to, save America and all that stuff.
And what men do and what women do and all that.
Well, that's the thing. I think, interestingly enough, if there's stuff in the book that could really hurt him in terms of his nomination, ironically, it is the utter contempt with which he speaks of, women not being in combat. And of course, Heth knows better. I mean, in a foreign deployment, there's a lot of places where a combat role and a non-combat role are separated by, yards. Just ask Tammy Duckworth. But, again, it's this culture of what would his future, because you asked what Trump's future army would look like. But, again, Heth, and I keep coming back to this word, adolescent or juvenile. It's lots of tough white guys with, beautiful women cheering them on, going into battle from foreign shores to the streets of Baltimore or San Francisco, if that's what it takes. All in the name of this kind of civilizational rescue.
After the break, we move from defense to intelligence. Who is Tulsi Gabbard, and what are her qualifications for Director of National Intelligence?
Hi, I'm Avery Trufelman, and maybe you can relate to this. There's so many great podcasts out there, but it's impossible to listen to them all. That's why I'm so happy to be the host of Hark Daily, a new way to hear the best moments from the best podcast conversations. Each weekday morning, you'll hear 5 captivating clips from amazing podcasts on the day's news, culture, and so much more, all in 20 minutes. And it's totally free. Check it out at harkdaily.com.
This episode is brought to you by Etsy.
Oh.
Hear that?
Okay. Thank you.
Etsy knows these aren't the sounds of holiday gifting. Well, not the ones you're hoping for. You want squeals of delight. Happy tears.
How did you?
And spontaneously written songs of joy.
I am so happy. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah.
Okay, the song needs a bit of work, but anyway, to get those reactions, make sure everyone on your list feels heard with handmade, handpicked, and designed gifts from small shops on Etsy. Gifts like personalized jewelry, custom artwork, cozy style items, vintage pieces, and home decor to celebrate all of your favorite people and their specific kind of special. For original gifts that say, I get you, Etsy has it.
Tulsi Gabbard. Let's move on to her. She's his pick for Director of National Intelligence. She also served in the military, the Hawaii National Guard. You've called her a national security risk. But before we get into that, what does the Director of National Intelligence do? Why was that office founded?
Right. After 9/11, after all the reports and postmortems, one concern was that every part of the American intelligence community, and there's like a dozen and a half agencies that do this stuff, NSA, CIA, the FBI, that they weren't talking to each other. I have to say, back at the time, I was against this, and I still am. They bolted on this big office called the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And that DNI is supposed to ride herd on all of these intelligence agencies. Now you're supposed to have this one person who represents the community, who kind of straightens out these internal squabbles and has access to everything because the DNI sits on top of the CIA, the NSA, and all the other agencies. And that's a really potentially powerful office.
Okay, so good timing. It's now a big and powerful office. That's the job. What's your reaction to the pick?
Well, she literally has no experience in any of this. Nothing. Zero. Like, not even tangentially. Her supporters say, well, she's lieutenant colonel. Yes, and her deployments were with, as support missions to a medical unit, a police unit, and a civil affairs unit. She's even in the military, never had anything to do with intelligence gathering, analysis, nothing. Her only other qualifications are that, she was in Congress and attended committee hearings, but she wasn't on the Intelligence Committee. So you have somebody who has no executive experience, has no intelligence experience, has no background in the field, but is just like Pete Hegseth, totally loyal, totally supportive, and looks good on TV.
Right. And why is she a security risk?
Because her views about people like Assad and Putin would really be disqualifying.
Well, can you what are her views that she's voiced? What has she said?
Right. Putin is misunderstood. We basically caused the Ukraine war. There's a kind of seriousness issue with Tulsi Gabbard, too. I find her sort of ethereal and kind of weird, to be honest with you. But she said, Zelensky and Putin and Biden, they all need to embrace the spirit of aloha.
Oh, boy. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I'm sorry, but if you have a top secret code word, compartmented information clearance, I don't really want to hear about how you think, you should help Putin embrace the spirit of aloha. With Assad, it's even scarier. I mean, she has been an apologist and a denier of some of the terrible things he's done. She met with him outside of government channels when she was a congressperson. And she took a lot of flack for that. And she said, well, I just think you have to listen to everybody. You can't solve these problems unless you go and listen.
Yeah. So as far as you can tell, what's the long game here? Is Trump just looking for someone who'll stay out of his way so he can communicate with whatever foreign leaders he wants and whatever way he wants, and there won't be anybody looking over his shoulder?
There's some of that. I mean, he resists adult supervision in everything, as he has in his whole life. But I think there's something much more sinister going on here. If you really want to subvert a democracy, if you really want to undermine the thousands and thousands of people who work in the federal workforce and do things that are pretty scary, to investigate your enemies, send troops into the streets, and so on. And the three departments you absolutely need are justice, defense, and the intelligence community. Justice, because you control the national cops, the FBI, and the national courts. The military, because that is a huge source of coercive power, obviously. And the intelligence community, because information is power, but also because the intelligence community is one of the other two branches that actually has people in it who have some control over coercive means, who have some ability to use violence. So I think that he's going for the trifecta of putting nakedly loyalist, unqualified people into these jobs as a way of saying to everyone in those departments, I'm in control. I run these. You're going to do what I say, and forget the Constitution, forget the law, forget everything except loyalty to Donald Trump. And that means you at the CIA, you at the FBI, you at the Justice Department, the courts, the cops, the military. And I think that's what's going on here. And I'll add one other thing. If all of these nominees get turfed, that doesn't mean the people coming in will be better.
Yeah. Yeah. You know what this is reminding me of? Our colleague, Peter Pomerantsev, who writes about autocracy and democracy. He always talks about how fear and humor are closely linked in an eroding democracy, because there is a sort of like troll joke factor to some of these nominations.
Right.
But underneath it is just this chilling fear that you described, like a strategy of the triumvirate of power,
Absolutely. And they get you used to it by doing things that are so shockingly unthinkable that it becomes thinkable.
Yeah.
Imagine if we were sitting here, 5 years ago. Actually, let's talk about Hegseth again for one moment. Hegseth's extramarital affairs apparently helped cost him the leadership of the VA.
Yeah, Tom, I was remembering that when I was first a reporter, the kind of thing that would sink a nominee was you failed to pay your nanny's taxes.
Or John Tower, drinks too much, hard drinker.
Yeah, and now we have a nominee with a sexual assault allegation. Now, he denies the allegation, but he did end up paying the woman who accused him as part of a non-disclosure agreement. And it's like, nah, he's fine,
Yeah, I know, whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, again, writing the kind of book he wrote would almost, the preface to that book should have been, I want to never be confirmed for anything ever.
Right.
And this was my argument about why we shouldn't have elected Donald Trump back in 2016. He wears down our standards to the point where vulgarity and crudeness and criminality and incompetence all just become part of our daily life.
Yeah.
When I look back 10 years, just in a decade of my life, I think the amount of change that has happened in the political environment in America is astonishing, and purely because we have signed on to this kind of, as you say, sort of comical and trashy but chilling change, step by step by step every day. We didn't do this all in 1 year. We did this like, the frog boiling exercise.
Yeah, I feel that way about the last 2 weeks. You glided by this, but I just want to say, unless Trump gets around the usual rules, all of these nominees do still need to be approved by the Senate.
Right.
So you would likely need 4 senators to oppose. What are the chances of that happening?
My big fear, I suppose I could start every sentence these days with my big fear.
Yeah.
One of my many fears is that Gates is the political equivalent of a flashbang grenade that is just thrown into the room and everybody's blinded and their ears are ringing and they're like, oh my God, Matt Gaetz, what kind of crazy nonsense was this? And Trump says, and when everybody kind of gets off the floor and collects themselves, Trump says, okay, fine, I'll give you Gaetz. And then he gets everybody else.
Yeah.
I'm writing something right now, actually, where I argued that the Senate should take these 4 terrible nominations, Gaetz, Gabbard, Hegseth, and then throw in Robert F. Kennedy, who is, not a threat to the existence of the United States, but to the health and well-being of millions of its children. Just take these 4 as a package and say, look, you're going to get a lot of other stuff. You're not getting these 4. That's the end of it. Because if they go one by one by one, Trump will wear them down. And I think that's what I'm worried about. Now, with that said, the Senate, my old neighborhood, the one thing that the senators love is the Senate.
Meaning what?
Meaning
they love to have the power of the Senate, the decorum of the Senate.
Yeah, they believe in the institution. I mean, you can see it with somebody like Susan Collins. Susan Collins loves being a senator and loves the romance of the Senate itself more than anything. And they don't like a president walking in and saying, listen, I want some guys, and the way you're going to do this is with a recess appointment where you're going to go out and take a walk, They don't like that. And I wonder if John Thune really wants to begin his time as Senate Majority Leader, one of the most important positions in the American government, being treated like a stooge.
Well, that's what we'll be watching for. Thank you for joining me today, Tom.
My pleasure, Hannah. Always nice to talk with you.
This episode of Radio Atlantic was produced by Janae West. It was edited by Claudina Bade, fact-checked by Sarah Krolewski, and engineered by Rob Smerciak. Claudina Bade is the executive producer of Atlantic Audio, and Andrea Valdez is our managing editor. I'm Hannah Rosen. Thank you for listening.
Hi, I'm Avery Trufelman, and maybe you can relate to this. There's so many great podcasts out there, but it's impossible to listen to them all. That's why I'm so happy to be the host of Hark Daily, a new way to hear the best moments from the best podcast conversations. Each weekday morning, you'll hear 5 captivating clips from amazing podcasts on the day's news, culture, and so much more, all in 20 minutes. And it's totally free. Check it out at harkdaily.com.